I swear, Trillin, if you spill one more drop of my coffee, I'm going to clone myself just to have someone else to yell at you, Leora grumbled, glancing over her shoulder as her assistant tried to balance a tray, two steaming mugs of synth caffeine wobbling dangerously. It was another day in the monotonous hell that was the Thrin Monastery, a place that would have been all serenity and deep peace if it weren't for the fact that it was actually a high-security cloning lab. A little less enlightenment, a little more Frankenstein. Sorry, Doc, hands are shaking because, aliens watching us 24/7. No pressure or anything, Trillin mumbled, managing to finally place the mugs down without incident. Leora snorted, taking a sip, the taste somewhere between burnt rubber and a broken promise. Good to know the Thrin's idea of gourmet is still a war crime in several star systems. The Thrin were an enigmatic bunch with more tentacles than common sense, their fascination with human nightmares bordering on the obsessive. But who was Leora to judge? She was just here to make sure the gene juice kept flowing and that humanity's worst fears were bottled up nice and tidy. Nightmare readings are off the charts, by the way. Something about falling, teeth, and a weird obsession with public nudity, Trillin commented, eyes flicking to the data screens lining the walls. They were filled with the kind of graphs that made your eyes want to crawl out of your skull just to avoid having to look at them. Sounds like your average Tuesday, Leora replied dryly. Honestly, I'm beginning to think humans just aren't right in the head. Might explain why we keep screwing everything up. The monastery looked like it had been designed by a minimalist with a penchant for stainless steel and existential dread. Stark, cold, and about as welcoming as a tax audit, the monks, deeply spiritual only when the Thrin were around, wandered the halls with a serenity reserved for those who didn't have nightmares weaponized. Why the Thrin are so interested in nightmares, I'll never understand. It's not like they can dream. Or maybe they do, and it's just 8 hours of waving their limbs around in the dark, Trillin mused, tapping at a console with the enthusiasm of someone considering a career change. Leora rubbed her temples. They say it's about predicting the future. Some high-minded nonsense that nightmares are a premonition of what's to come. Personally, I think they're just bored. Must be tough, being a superior alien race and still not having Netflix. They worked in silence for a moment, the quiet punctuated by the gentle hum of machinery and Trillin's persistent tapping. Leora glanced at the latest batch of clones, suspended in their nutrient tanks, faces serene in the way only the unconsciously ignorant could manage. Each one a potential nightmare generator, a ticket to whatever grim lottery the Thrin were running. Think any of them will dream of something useful? Trillin asked, looking at the clones with about as much enthusiasm as a cat in a bathtub. Unlikely. Last one just had a recurring dream about a giant broccoli chasing him through his childhood home. I think we're safe from any prophetic insights. Hey, that could be a metaphor. Maybe we're all just running from our veggies. Leora chuckled despite herself. Or maybe we're just idiots trying to find meaning in chaos. How's that for a metaphor? Deep and kind of depressing. You've missed your calling, Doc. You could have been a motivational speaker. The conversation lulled again, each lost in their own thoughts until the door slid open with a hiss, revealing one of their Thrin overseers. Its name, unpronounceable by human standards, had been colloquially dubbed Squidward by the staff. The creature's skin shimmered an unsettling shade of bioluminescent blue, eyes like black pearls looking straight through them. Doctor. Leora, Assistant Trillin, it began in a voice reminiscent of someone gargling marbles. We require results from your latest batch. The High Council grows impatient. Welcome to the club, Leora muttered under her breath before putting on her best customer service smile. Of course, Squidward, we're just compiling the data now. You know how it is, can't rush genius. Or the lack thereof, Trillin added helpfully. The Thrin's eyes narrowed or perhaps just twinkled ominously. It was hard to tell. Ensure the results are satisfactory, or there will be consequences. Is that a threat or a promise? Trillin whispered after the alien left, the door sliding shut with a finality that was almost comforting in its certainty. Could be both, knowing them. Come on, let's see if we can make some sense of this mess before they decide we're more useful as organic mulch. Leora sighed, returning to her screens with renewed determination, or at least the grim acceptance that procrastination wasn't an option. They worked through the night, the screams of nightmares echoing in their ears, data spilling onto screens like a symphony of madness. Leora's eyes burned with exhaustion, her mind a fog of half-formed ideas and caffeine withdrawals. Hey, Doc, Trillin said suddenly, voice low with the kind of apprehension that usually accompanied finding out your credit card had been declined. You might want to see this. Unless it's the winning lottery numbers or a way out of this place. I'm not sure I care, Leora replied, but she leaned over all the same. The screen displayed a series of readings that were, to put it mildly, not entirely comforting. Nightmares, yes, but something more. A pattern emerging from the chaos, a tapestry woven from the threads of fear and foreboding. Looks like someone's been dreaming of the end of the world. Again, Trillin commented, trying to mask the edge in his voice with humor, but failing. Let me guess. Fire, brimstone, and a giant boot crushing us all into oblivion, more like a flash of light than nothing, a real party ender. Leora frowned, her mind ticking over the implications. Could just be a nightmare, or it could be the Thrinn are right, and we're all about to have a very bad day. The implications hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. The kind of thing you didn't talk about in polite company because it killed the mood faster than an uninvited in-law at a wedding. You think we should tell Squidward? Trillin asked, voice hushed, afraid of the answer. Leora hesitated, the weight of responsibility a tangible thing. If we don't and it turns out to be true, we're screwed. If we do and it's nothing, we're still screwed, just slower. Guess it's a win-win for us, Trillin said with a humorless laugh. Let's just hope they don't decide to test their theories on us. I'm not keen on finding out if nightmares can be made into reality. Not unless you can dream up a way out of here, Trillin replied, a thin smile tugging at his lips despite the dire situation. They prepared the report, fingers tapping keys in a rhythm of resigned doom. The feeling of being watched was ever present, the walls themselves seemingly alive with scrutiny. Think the Thrinn ever worry about losing control of these nightmares? Trillin asked, breaking the silence once more. Only if they're smart. Which, given they hired us, I'd say that's debatable. Fair point. The door hissed open again, Squidward making another entrance with all the grace of a damp squid on a marble floor. It regarded them with that same infuriatingly serene expression, like it knew something they didn't. Have you completed your analysis? It asked, voice a blend of authority and condescension. We have, Leora replied, sliding the report across the console. I'd say we're on the edge of a breakthrough, or a nervous breakdown. Hard to tell. Squidward's tentacle-like appendages delicately picked up the data pad, tentacles twitching as they absorbed the information. We shall see what the High Council makes of this. Be prepared for further instructions. Oh, we'll be here. Probably, Trillin said, offering a mock salute that would have gotten him court-martialed on a real military ship. The alien left without another word, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed in the silence left behind. You think they'll buy it? Trillin asked, once they were alone again. Who knows? Maybe they'll just decide this whole nightmare experiment was a bad idea and chuck us all out an airlock, Leora said, half joking, half hoping. See, you are a motivational speaker. Always looking on the bright side, Trillin replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Leora sighed, sitting back in her chair, the weight of their reality pressing down like a leaden blanket. Let's just hope tomorrow's nightmares don't involve us. I've had enough of those to last a lifetime. And as they settled into the silence, the distant hum of the machines and the quiet whispers of clone dreams filled the room, the future a dark tapestry of uncertainties, woven with threads of fear, foreboding, and just a touch of hopeless optimism. The Thrinn monastery was about as serene as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Leora, already regretting the gallon of synth caffeine she'd consumed, was tapping her finger against her temple, like she could somehow massage the solutions out of her brain. It was far too early or late, depending on how much you despise time zones, for existential crises or alien conspiracy theories, but here she was, knee-deep in both. Trillin, her perpetually nervous assistant, was flitting around like a moth on amphetamines, occasionally shooting glances at the door as if the boogerman might bust through any second. You know, he began, nervously scratching the back of his neck. The way they react to the data makes me think they actually believe in this nightmare prophecy stuff. Aliens obsessed with our bad dreams, Leora said with a weary sigh, staring at the blinking lights that indicated the clone's brain activity. Maybe they're just jealous they can't have their own, or maybe they're just tired of reruns. Trillin forced a laugh. Imagine living in a world where your main entertainment is the trash fire that is human subconscious. I'd probably blow up a few planets just for some fun too, like watching a train wreck, Leora agreed, still scrutinizing the readouts. Except the train's on fire, and the conductor's on a bender. The latest nightmares were more than just your run-of-the-mill existential dread. They were full-on apocalyptic. And not the fun kind with zombies and chainsaws. This was the good old-fashioned end of everything, annihilation with a side of hopelessness. The readouts weren't helping her mounting headache. As she peered over the data, something caught her eye. A sequence of peaks and troughs that seemed eerily familiar, like a song stuck in your head that you couldn't quite place. Hey, check this out, Leora said, beckoning Trillin over. Tell me that doesn't look like the patterns from last night's batch. Trillin squinted at the screen, eyes narrowing. You mean the ones with the big boom and the nothingness after? Exactly. And look, Leora continued, drawing a line between the data points. This dream happened minutes before that plasma storm hit the nearby colony. Coincidence? Trillin swallowed, the sound loud in the sterile room. We're talking about predicting catastrophes with nightmares. That's a new kind of messed up. Yeah, welcome to the most depressing science fair ever. Leora rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of the madness. We need to figure out if these patterns are repeating. Otherwise, we're just playing bingo with doomsday. The door slid open again, a sound that was fast becoming as irritating as nails on a chalkboard. Squidward returned, its tentacle appendages trailing behind it like an afterthought. Doctor. Leora, it began, its voice a gravelly melody that made you want to clean out your ears. The High Council has noted your recent observations. They are intriguing. Glad to hear you're entertained, Leora replied, biting back sarcasm sharper than a razor's edge. The correlation between your subject's dreams and subsequent events warrants further investigation. Squidward's eyes, those bottomless black pearls, seemed to pierce through her soul, or maybe just her patience. So you're saying you think there's something to it? Trillin asked, not bothering to hide the disbelief in his voice. Squidward's gaze shifted, a movement subtle enough to make you wonder if it even moved at all. The High Council does not believe in coincidence, of course not. Coincidence is for amateurs, Leora muttered sardonically. We will increase monitoring of these nightmare patterns. Continue your observations. The Council expects a comprehensive report on further findings, Squidward instructed, its tone leaving no room for argument. So what you're saying is, keep doing what we're doing, but do it better, Trillin sighed, running a hand through his hair with the resignation of a man who'd lost a bet to fate. Exactly, Squidward confirmed, without the courtesy of a single twitch of its alien features. The door closed with its usual hiss, leaving Leora and Trillin once more in their cocoon of artificial light and grim responsibilities. Well, looks like we're upgrading from mildly interested to creepily fascinated, Leora said. How's that for career highlight? Bet this wasn't in the job description. Trillin attempted a smile, but it was more a grimace than anything else. So, what now? Leora leaned back in her chair, feeling the tension of the past few hours settle into a dull throb at the back of her head. We keep poking the hornet's nest and hope we don't get stung. Their work continued in that strange amalgamation of dread and curiosity. The nightmare data flowed like a river, each clone offering up snippets of their subconscious fears. Fires, floods, inexplicable voids, the whole surreal gallery of things that made you wake up in a cold sweat. The Thrin's interest was a double-edged sword, sharp and unyielding. They hovered like vultures, their fascination morphing from a benign curiosity to a consuming obsession. Starting to feel like lab rats in our own experiment, Trillin commented, typing in a string of commands that made the screens dance with data. Except in this case, the cheese is a way out of this cosmic mess, Leora replied, rubbing her temple again. And the maze keeps getting bigger. As the hours dragged on, the clones began to stir in their tanks, the night's nightmares having worn themselves out. Their dreams faded like morning mist, leaving only the data behind. Doc, got something here, Trillin called, his voice a blend of excitement and trepidation that made Leora's heart skip a beat. What is it? Leora joined him, peering at the screen. The line graph was jagged, chaotic, but hidden within was that same pattern again. I'll be damned. Another one, and look at the timestamp, Trillin added, pointing at the screen. Matches up with that power outage we had an hour ago. Took out half the sector. Another coincidence. Leora mused, though she already knew the answer. The Thrin didn't believe in coincidences, and maybe she shouldn't either. Trillin let out a low whistle. This is getting freaky. Tell me about it, Leora replied, her mind churning with possibilities and the kind of dread usually reserved for tax season. As they worked, the implications of their findings hung over them like a storm cloud ready to burst. The potential was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. If nightmares truly held predictive power, then they were sitting on a gold mine or a ticking time bomb. The day passed in a blur of activity, the hum of machinery and the flickering screens their only companions. They were deep in the throes of analysis when the door opened once more, Squidward gliding in with its usual fluid grace. Dr. Leora, Assistant Trillin, it acknowledged, its voice as smooth as a gravel road. The High Council has reviewed your latest data. Oh good, I was worried they'd taken up knitting instead, Leora said, earning a choked sound that might have been a laugh from Trillin. The patterns are compelling, Squidward continued, either oblivious to or ignoring Leora's sarcasm. The Council believes further study could yield significant insights. Great. Maybe next we can sort out why I keep dreaming of my teeth falling out, Leora said, folding her arms across her chest. Squidward blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. The Council has decided to increase your resources. Additional clones will be provided for the next phase of your research. More nightmares. Just what I always wanted, Trillin muttered under his breath. Ensure your findings are expedited. The Council desires swift results, Squidward instructed, its tone brooking no dissent. Sure thing, Squidward. We'll just pull an all-nighter or two. Nothing says productivity like sleep deprivation, Leora replied, her voice laced with more sarcasm than a teenage goth's diary. The alien offered no further comment, instead gliding from the room with all the urgency of a cloud passing overhead. The door sealed behind it, leaving a silence that felt almost accusatory. Well, guess we'd better get started, Trillin said, reaching for a fresh data pad. Wouldn't want to disappoint our tentacled overlords. Yeah, wouldn't want them to think we aren't taking our existential dread seriously. Leora agreed, though inwardly she wondered how far down the rabbit hole they were willing, or able to go. As they returned to their work, the sense of being watched never quite left them. The monastery, a labyrinth of sterile corridors and whispered nightmares. Each new clone was another opportunity, another potential harbinger of doom wrapped in a shroud of dreams. Time slipped by, the monotony only broken by the occasional clatter of a dropped tool or the beep of a finished analysis. The weight of their task pressed down, heavy and relentless like a forgotten debt come due. Think there's an end to this? Trillin asked, breaking the silence that seemed to stretch on endlessly. An end? Leora considered the question, the weight of it almost as tangible as the data that lined their screens. Maybe. But I'd bet it's not the one we're hoping for. Optimism, thy name is not Leora, Trillin quipped, but his smile was a fragile thing, worn at the edges. As Leora continued to sift through the data, the question loomed larger than ever. Were they simply catalogers of unconscious chaos, or were they uncovering something that could change everything? And as the stars blinked into existence outside the monastery's walls, cold and distant, the answers felt as elusive as sleep in the face of nightmares. Trillin, do you ever get the feeling we're starring in our own personal horror movie? Leora asked, her eyes glued to the flickering screen that vomited data like a drunken oracle. Every damn day, Trillin replied, not looking up from his tablet, the digital glow giving him the pallor of a corpse in a low-budget thriller. The Thrin had decided they were going to be more hands-on with the Nightmare Project. And by hands-on, that meant they were probably watching their every move with more cameras than a celebrity meltdown. Leora had always wanted an audience, but not exactly like this. Look at this, Leora pointed at a squiggle that looked like a heart monitor for someone trying to deadlift a planet. Another one of those nightmare patterns, but this one seems to be throwing out more red flags than a bad relationship. Trillin peered over her shoulder. It's almost like the universe is trying to tell us something, but it's only fluent in cryptic. Isn't that always the way? Leora sighed, the weight of it all pressing down like a bad hangover. Anyway, we've got to figure out what this means before we end up needing therapy ourselves. The door hissed open, and Squidward made its customary entrance, like a barnacle boss gliding on invisible skates. Doctor. Leora, Assistant Trillin, it began, voice gravelly enough to exfoliate your soul. The High Council is intensifying its oversight. Your research is of great interest. Yeah, kind of figured, Leora replied, resisting the urge to roll her eyes so hard they might pop out and join the Thrin in whatever dimension of scrutiny they existed in. More interest than my student loans, or less. The Council will be implementing additional measures to ensure the integrity of the data, Squidward continued, ignoring the sarcasm that dripped like acid from Leora's words. Measures? Like what? Shock collars, Trillin asked, half joking, but only half. In this place you never knew. Enhanced surveillance, Squidward said without missing a beat, its tentacles doing a little dance that might have been menacing if you squinted and had a vivid imagination. Rest assured, your compliance is appreciated. Sure, nothing says teamwork like a little light oppression, Leora muttered as Squidward exited, leaving the room feeling colder, and not just because the temperature control was on the fritz again. Once the door slid shut, Leora turned to Trillin. We need a plan, something that keeps us a step ahead of our nosy friends. Something like pretending to comply while secretly doing our own research, Trillin suggested, the hint of rebellion in his voice like a candle in the dark. Exactly. Time to play the game of cosmic hide and seek. Let's see how much we can dig up on these nightmares before the Thrin decide we're too much trouble. Trillin nodded, a nervous energy sparking in his eyes. All right, let's get to it. But if we end up dissected for science, I'm holding you responsible. Deal. Leora smirked, kicking off her shoes and settling in for a night of mystery-solving that would put any detective novel to shame. They worked in near silence, the hum of the machinery a constant reminder that someone somewhere was watching. The data flowed, each line and curve an echo of terror from the unconscious minds of the clones. Leora and Trillin sifted through it all, searching for patterns, connections, anything that might explain the strange link between dreams and reality. Hours passed in a blur, the synthetic caffeine keeping them on the edge of jittery exhaustion. Leora's nerves felt like they were being played by a toddler on the drums, but the work had a rhythm of its own, a steady beat of discovery and dread. Look at this, Trillin said suddenly, his voice a hissed whisper as if afraid the walls might have ears. There's a genetic marker showing up in all the clones having these prediction dreams. Leora leaned over, eyes scanning the data with a ferocious intensity. You're right, it's like a genetic signature for doom. Who knew DNA could be so prophetic? Maybe we can use this to filter out the clones that might have these dreams, Trillin suggested, the spark of a plan lighting up the gloom. And keep it off the Thrin's radar, Leora added, her mind racing. We might just be able to pull that off. Start by tweaking the readout so it looks like routine anomalies. As they worked, the tension in the room grew thick enough to choke on. Every whisper of the air system felt like a shadow creeping closer. But they pressed on, the lure of understanding outweighing the fear of discovery. Trillin cracked his knuckles, a series of pops like gunfire in the quiet room. You ever wonder what the Thrin actually want with this nightmare stuff? More than I worry about what happens if we find out, Leora replied, absently massaging her temples. The less they know what we're onto, the better. Stealth became their ally as they navigated the digital landscape, tweaking data here, disguising anomalies there, playing cat and mouse with an opponent who had better resources and likely fewer scruples. Still think we're the good guys? Trillin asked, a hint of humor in his voice. I think we're the only guys, Leora said, a wry grin tugging at her lips despite the grim situation. And I'll take those odds over being a puppet any day. The clandestine work, though exhausting, brought with it a sense of purpose. For the first time, they were doing more than just cataloging nightmares. They were taking control, crafting their own destiny from the darkness. Night crept on, unnoticed except for the gradual dimming of the lights, the monastery's way of suggesting they take a break. But neither Leora nor Trillin showed signs of slowing. They were in too deep now, the thrill of potential discovery driving them. And then, like a curtain rising on a particularly unwelcome act, the door slid open again. Squidward returned, a silent sentinel gliding in with that unnerving grace. Dr. Leora, Assistant Trillin, it intoned, as though reciting from a script. The High Council requests a progress update. Leora forced a smile, the kind that could bluff its way through any poker game. We've got a batch of new data cooking up, should be ready for your review soon. Squidward's eyes, dark as the space between stars, studied her for a moment longer than comfortable. Efficiency is appreciated, it said finally, before exiting as quietly as it had come. As soon as the door closed, Trillin turned to Leora. Think it suspects, probably, Leora admitted, but suspicion's not proof. We just need to keep playing it cool, like a cucumber in a snowstorm. The night wore on, the ayers blending together until they were more concept than reality. Yet through it all, Leora and Trillin persisted, their minds sharp and focused, driven by the need to uncover the truth hiding within the dreams. Eventually, a plan took shape, an idea that might just tip the scales in their favor. By exploiting the genetic marker they'd found, they could preempt the Thrin's plans, giving themselves an edge in a game where the rules were constantly changing. Do you think we'll ever get out of this place? Trillin asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile hope they were building. Leora shrugged, though the gesture was as heavy as if Atlas himself bore it. I like to think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, just hoping it's not an oncoming train. Trillin chuckled softly, a sound that was more out of place than rain in a desert. At least we'll be ready, whatever happens. They continued their clandestine project, each small victory a reminder that even in the heart of an alien-controlled nightmare, humans had a knack for finding a way forward. And as the stars continued their dance outside, indifferent to the struggles below, Leora and Trillin pressed on, determined to solve the puzzle before them. It was a delicate balance, deception and discovery, fear and determination, but it was a balance they were willing to maintain. Because in a universe where nightmares could predict the future, they figured that humans, with their stubbornness and snark, might just have a shot at rewriting the script. So, Leora said, her voice weary but laced with a defiant hope, shall we show these tentacled overlords just what resourceful humans can do? Trillin nodded, a fierce grin breaking across his face. Let's give them a show they'll never forget. And with that, they dove back into their work, ready to face whatever nightmares lay ahead. You know, it's like the High Council's got a bet going on how many ways it can screw with us before we snap, Leora grumbled, eyeing the data readout like it had personally insulted her lineage. Trillin snorted, juggling his tablet like it was a hand grenade on a short fuse. If I wake up one day with a tattoo that says property of the Thrin, I'm out here. The universe can kiss my backside on the way out. Their cramped office in the Thrin monastery was a shrine to chaos, stainless steel cold enough to make a refrigerator jealous and about as welcoming. The walls were bare except for screens flashing with more red flags than a festival of bad omens. Leora shot a glance at the flickering screen. I swear if one more clone brain explodes into a nightmare about giant tentacled overlords, I'm going to start charging for the therapy sessions. Cause the universe obviously needs it. Trillin tapped away on his tablet, a grimace etched on his face like a permanent tattoo. We gotta keep the Thrin in the dark, but those bastards have more eyes on us than a fly on caffeine. Which is why, Leora said, leaning in conspiratorially, we need to keep tweaking the data. Make it look as benign as a fluffy kitten until we've got the whole picture. The door hissed open, as if programmed to annoy them just when they were getting somewhere. Squidward glided in, its voice gravelly like sandpaper in a blender. The High Council demands further utilization of nightmare data for future predictions. Leora turned, her annoyance wrapped in a smile sharper than a razor made of sarcasm. And here I thought they just wanted us to bake cookies for the intergalactic bake sale. Trillin kept his head down, letting Leora take the lead. He was good at avoiding eye contact. Years of practice dodging responsibility had honed it to a fine art. Squidward's eyes, unblinking and dark as a black hole's conscience, stayed locked on Leora. The Council believes the potential for predictive modeling is substantial. Your cooperation is vital. Right, vital, like air or taxes, Leora muttered under her breath, knowing full well Squidward's hearing was impeccable. We'll get on that. As Squidward exited, the room's temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. Leora turned to Trillin, exhaling the way someone might when they've narrowly avoided a speeding asteroid. We're skating on thinner ice than a snowflake at a bonfire. Guess we better start taking skating lessons, Trillin quipped, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. So what's the plan now? Keep up the facade. But we need more eyes, human eyes. On this, Leora said, her tone serious enough to sober a clown. There's gotta be others like us tired of playing fetch for our tentacled overlords. Trillin nodded, his fingers dancing across his tablet in a rhythm that spoke of desperation masked as determination. Think we can trust anyone here? Trust? Nah, that's a luxury we can't afford, but mutual benefit. That's a currency everyone understands. Leora's eyes gleamed with a rebellious glint. Let's find the ones who hate this place as much as we do. Their search began in the mess hall, a place ironically devoid of any mess, more sterile than a surgeon's glove. A few human workers dotted the room, most absorbed in their own worlds, trying to stave off the creeping existential dread that came with living under constant scrutiny. Leora nodded towards a table where a young man sat, nursing a cup of synth caffeine like it was his last lifeline. What about him? Looks like he's plotting something. Trillin cocked an eyebrow, or just wondering why he signed up for this gig instead of joining the circus. They approached, Leora leading the way with all the subtlety of a charging rhino. Hey, mind if we join you? The young man looked up, eyes wide, like a deer caught in the headlights of their insurrection. Sure, I guess. Name's Leora, this is Trillin. We're conducting a survey on job satisfaction. She flashed a smile that could cut glass. How satisfied are you with being the Thrin's lab rat? He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Name's Nico. And let's just say if I had a credit for every time I've thought about jumping out the airlock, I'd own this damn place. Trillin slid into the seat across from Nico, leaning in with the air of a used spaceship salesman about to close a deal. We're working on a little side project. Might be of interest to someone less than thrilled with our hosts. Nico's eyes darted around, checking for unwanted ears. You've got my attention. What are you cooking up? Let's just say we've got some intel on these nightmares that would make the Thrin's tentacles curl, Leora said, keeping her voice low. We're looking to gather a few like-minded folks who aren't afraid to stir the pot a bit. Nico's lips twitched, a hint of a grin breaking through the gloom like the first ray of sun after a long night. Count me in. Anything to make those bastards sweat. With Nico on board, they began to form the ragtag beginnings of an internal rebellion, a motley crew of disgruntled scientists, techs, and even a janitor who, inexplicably, seemed to know more about the monastery's layout than anyone else. The stakes continued to rise, like someone kept upping the ante in a game of poker where everyone was bluffing. The Thrin's pressure to use the nightmare data for predictive control only intensified, threatening to crush their fragile operation before it even took flight. Each day was a balancing act, a high-wire routine with no safety net. Leora and Trillin kept weaving their web of deceit, tweaking data, masking anomalies, and feeding the Thrin just enough truth to keep them from suspecting the depth of their defiance. Leora found herself in the monastery's labyrinthine corridors, the sterile environment echoing with the distant hum of machinery. Nico walked beside her, glancing around like a tourist in a particularly unfriendly city. You think we really stand a chance? Chance. Leora shrugged, the movement almost imperceptible. You've got about as much chance as a snowball in a neutron star, but it's better than nothing. Optimism's not your strong suit, huh? Nico said, a lopsided grin on his face. Hey, I'm optimistic enough to think we won't all get vaporized the moment they find out. Leora shot back. That's something. The rebellion grew slowly, like a stubborn weed in a concrete jungle. They gathered in secret, whispering plans and sharing what little intelligence they managed to scrape together without alerting the Thrin's all-seeing eyes. In one of their clandestine meetings, Trillin stood before the group, eyes brighter than they'd been in a long time. We need to find a way to subvert the nightmare data. Use it against them. Leora nodded, arms crossed, confidence as tough as old boots. We've got the genetic markers. If we can manipulate the data to predict Thrin actions instead of just human nightmares, we might gain an edge. One of the techs, a wiry woman named Yara, spoke up. And how do you propose we do that without setting off every alarm in the place? Carefully, Leora replied, the word heavy with implication. We need to keep feeding them just enough to stay off their radar. Make it look like we're doing exactly what they want, all while we're building our own predictive model. It was a long shot, crazier than a hyena on laughing gas, but it was all they had. Their nights were spent hunched over data terminals, eyes bleary and nerves strung tighter than a bowstring, each day a battle against time and discovery. The Thrin, for all their surveillance, seemed unaware of the storm brewing beneath their very tentacles. Squidward made regular appearances, its gravelly voice a constant reminder of their precarious position. Dr. Leora, Assistant Trillin, it said one day, voice as smooth as gravel in a blender. The High Council requires a comprehensive report by week's end. Leora feigned a smile, the expression feeling foreign on her face. We'll have it ready, you know us, always striving for excellence. Squidward's eyes flickered, as if it saw more than she'd intended to reveal. The Council values your dedication. As it left, Leora let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Week's end, huh? They really know how to light a fire under us. Trillin rolled his eyes, more like a flamethrower. You think they suspect anything suspect? Maybe. But I'm betting they're too wrapped up in their own superiority to see what's happening right under their noses. She paused, a flicker of doubt crossing her mind. We just need to stay a step ahead. The days blurred into nights, each one darker than the last. But within that darkness, the flicker of rebellion grew, a flame that refused to be snuffed out. The humans, tired of being mere pawns in an alien game, were finding their strength, their defiance. Trillin poked at his tablet, frustration evident in the stiff set of his shoulders. I've got a bad feeling about this. Like, we're about to be discovered and dunked in a vat of Thrin slime bad. Leora chuckled, despite the seriousness of the situation. Then let's make sure we're the ones doing the dunking. Their resolve hardened, as unyielding as the bleak steel walls surrounding them. It was clear now, this wasn't just about survival, but about reclaiming control, about proving that even in the face of overwhelming power, humans could be more than just victims of fate. They worked tirelessly, forging alliances where they could, crafting a network of resistance that might just tip the scales in their favor. It was a delicate dance, one misstep away from disaster, but it was one they were willing to undertake. As the deadline loomed, the tension ratcheted up, a noose tightening with every tick of the clock. But instead of fear, they found something else in the pressure, purpose. So what's next? Nico asked during one meeting, eyes alight with the thrill of rebellion. Leora looked around at the faces gathered, each one reflecting the same defiant spirit that burned within her. Next, we show the Thrin just what happens when you try to put a leash on humans. Their laughter echoed in the small room, a sound that was equal parts defiance and desperation. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a flicker of hope in a universe that seemed intent on stomping it out. And as they returned to their work, the weight of their task didn't seem quite as heavy, because for the first time they weren't just reacting, they were acting, taking the fight to their oppressors and making their stand in the only way they knew how. Together against the odds, they continued their fight, determined to show the Thrin that even in the darkest of nightmares, humans had a way of finding the light. The Thrin monastery was about as welcoming as a porcupine with an attitude problem, and today it seemed even more uninviting. The sterile corridors hummed with an ominous energy, as if the very walls were conspiring against them. Leora, with a mug of synth caffeine clutched like a lifeline, trudged towards the cramped office they called their base of operations. She found Trillin already there, juggling his tablet with the finesse of a sleep-deprived octopus. His attempts to keep it steady were about as successful as a drunk trying to walk a tightrope. Morning, or whatever the hell it is, he mumbled. Morning, Leora snorted. Does it even matter anymore? Every day feels like it's been dragged backwards through a black hole. Trillin nodded sagely, or as sagely as one could with bloodshot eyes. Tell me about it. I swear these screens are plotting to make our eyes bleed. The screens flashed their usual warnings, bathing the room in a sickly glow that made everything seem even more grim. They were supposed to display clone brain activity readouts, but lately they seemed better at predicting migraines than anything useful. Squidward's gravelly voice crackled through the room's speaker, cutting through the air sharper than a laser scalpel. Dr. Leora, Assistant Trillin, the High Council requires increased compliance. Resistance will not be tolerated. Trillin raised an eyebrow. Ah, Squidward, charming as ever. I'm guessing they're not sending us a fruit baskets. Leora laughed hollowly, more like a one-way trip out the airlock. What's the latest demand? Immediate submission of all nightmare data. Unaltered, Squidward replied, its voice as soothing as nails on a chalkboard. The High Council grows impatient with delays. Impatient, Leora muttered as Squidward cut the connection. They're like a toddler who missed nap time. Trillin glanced at Leora, his expression a mixture of worry and resignation. You think they suspect we're doing more than just cozying up with nightmares? If they do, we're in deeper shit than I thought, Leora replied, her gaze shifting to the screens. But I've got a feeling they're just getting twitchy. We keep this up and they might just start peeling us like grapes. The rebellion, once a flickering ember, now seemed on the verge of being stamped out. The Thrin's oppressive measures had peaked, and they weren't exactly handing out gold stars for effort. Anyone suspected of subversion was making abrupt career changes, usually to the role of test subject or worse. Leora didn't sleep much these days, but when she did, the nightmares came with a vengeance. Last night had been particularly vivid, a cataclysmic vision of destruction that felt more like a premonition than a mere bad dream. She recounted it to Trillin with all the enthusiasm of a funeral director. It was messy, she said, tracing patterns on her tablet like she could somehow sketch away the dread. There was fire, chaos, and a whole lot of screaming. Not exactly a feel-good flick. Sounds like our average Tuesday, Trillin joked, though the humor fell flat. You think it's a warning or just your brain's way of throwing a tantrum? Leora shrugged. Could be both. Maybe the High Council's planning something big, and they're too stupid to realize their elaborate charades don't fool anyone with half a brain. Well, Trillin sighed, we survived this long by not underestimating their stupidity. Can't change tactics now. The monastery's air was thick with unseen tension, the kind that curled around your lungs and squeezed tight. The High Council had ramped up their oversight, throwing suspicion around like confetti at a parade. Only this parade had all the joy of a funeral march. Word of the Thrin's latest crackdowns trickled in through their cobbled network of informants. Yara, ever the bringer of bad news, reported that another group had been caught trying to tamper with the nightmare feeds. Their fate wasn't hard to imagine. Seems like the council's run out of patience, she said, sitting across from Leora and Trillin. I heard they're planning on making examples of the others. Trillin's face was a mask of sardonic disbelief. Always a party with these guys. Nothing says loyalty like a public execution. What else can we do? Nico asked, his voice carrying a desperate edge. They're tightening the noose. We're going to be next. Leora's eyes narrowed, her resolve hardening. We keep moving forward. They can't punish what they can't prove. But it was getting harder to keep hope alive when every move felt like walking barefoot on broken glass. The Thrin were relentless, and the human spirit, though resilient, was beginning to feel the weight of the alien regime. Their clandestine meetings became gatherings of whispered fears and shared anxieties. Plans were drawn, redrawn, and eventually crumpled under the relentless pressure. It was no longer about winning, it was about surviving. Leora's nightmare predictions, once dismissed as mental static, now loomed over them like a storm cloud. The High Council's intentions were unclear, but whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to be pleasant. Leora, Trillin said, breaking the silence of their office, you really think these nightmares are going to be the end of us? Hard to say, Leora replied, draining the last of her synth caffeine. But if they are, I'm not going down without hurling a few choice expletives. Maybe flip them the galactic finger on the way out. Sounds like a plan, Trillin chuckled, though it held none of the humor it should have. Squidward's voice interrupted again, ever the harbinger of doom. A reminder the High Council expects full cooperation. Failure will result in severe consequences. Yeah, tell them to take a number, Leora spat, cutting the connection. I'm sick of their empty threats. The air felt heavier with every passing day, each breath a reminder of their precarious position. Leora couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from complete annihilation. Despite the looming dread, they continued their work, driven by a stubborn refusal to submit. The humans were nothing if not defiant, a quality that had served them well up to now. But even the most resilient spirit has its breaking point. The High Council's demands became increasingly unreasonable, like a toddler's wish list to a very confused Santa Claus. Their interest in the nightmare data reached an almost pathological level, and compliance became a dance with death. Every night, Leora's dreams took on new layers of terror, each more vivid and disturbing than the last. They were messages she believed, fragments of some greater truth that her conscious mind hadn't yet deciphered. During one particularly restless sleep, Leora jolted awake, her heart pounding like a war drum. She'd seen the monastery in flames, the Thrin's twisted form silhouetted against the inferno. It felt real, too real to dismiss. Bad one? Trillin asked when she recounted it the next day, trying to mask his concern with humor. I've had dates that went worse. It was something else, Leora admitted, tapping her fingers against the table. I think it's a warning. The future, maybe, or just my brain being a sadistic asshole. Well, if it's the future, at least we won't have to worry about laundry, Trillin quipped, though his eyes betrayed his unease. Days turned to weeks, the strain carving deep lines into their faces. The rebellion that once burned brightly now flickered, a struggling candle against the void. but giving up wasn't an option, not when they'd come this far. Nico approached Leora in one of the many sterile hallways, his expression as grim as the metal walls. "Any idea what we're going to do if it all goes south? Run," Leora said simply, a bitter smile on her lips. "And hope we're faster than the Thrin's tentacles." "I was hoping for a bit more strategy," Nico replied, trying to maintain a semblance of optimism. "Strategy?" Leora laughed, a hollow sound that echoed down the corridor. "We're way past strategy, Nico. This is survival. The only plan is to keep breathing." Each day felt like a countdown to disaster, a ticking time bomb with no clear way to defuse it. The humans carried on, driven by stubbornness and a refusal to succumb to despair. But underneath, the fear simmered, waiting to erupt. Leora and Trillin continued their clandestine meetings, their plans becoming more desperate as the Thrin's stranglehold tightened. The nightmare predictions, once a source of intrigue, now hung over them like a death sentence. "We need a miracle," Trillin said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. Leora shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Miracles are for fairy tales, Trillin. We're in a shit show of epic proportions. But we're not done yet," Trillin reminded her, his gaze steady. "We've still got a few cards left to play." "Yeah," Leora replied, her voice laced with determination. "Let's just hope we don't end up playing solitaire." The rebellion might have been faltering, but it wasn't finished. The humans, battered and bruised, refused to lay down and accept defeat. They'd come too far, sacrificed too much, to let the Thrin's oppressive regime snuff out their spark. As they pressed on, the specter of Leora's nightmares loomed ever larger, a grim reminder of the challenges ahead. But within the darkness, there flickered a stubborn light, a refusal to surrender, a determination to fight back. Together, they faced the unknown with grim resolve, united in their defiance against the Thrin's tyranny. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them moving forward, one step at a time, through the encroaching shadows. And as the days dragged on, each more uncertain than the last, one thought kept them going. If they were living a nightmare, they'd damn well find a way to wake up. Leora stared at the blinking monitors, the synth caffeine doing its damnedest to keep her eyelids from staging a coup. The screens painted a picture of chaos, brain activity spikes that looked more like a seismograph during an earthquake than anything human. The Thrin found this fascinating, but then again they found collecting toenail clippings fascinating. Trillin shuffled in, juggling his tablet like he was auditioning for Cirque de No Sleep. "Anything juicy?" he asked, his voice a blend of sarcasm and resignation. "Just the usual," Leora replied, pointing at a particularly frenetic readout. "This one's dreaming about being devoured by intergalactic hamsters. Is that supposed to be a warning?" Trillin squinted at the screen. "Because I'm not buying hamster insurance." Leora chuckled despite herself. "Look closer. It's not just random noise. It's shifting patterns." Trillin leaned in, peering at the data like it was a magic eye puzzle. "You mean like an accidental Picasso?" "More like an intentional one," Leora said, her voice rising with a mix of excitement and dread. "These nightmares, they're not just nightmares, they're predictions. But I think they can be altered." Trillin's eyes widened, a spark of hope flickering behind his exhaustion. "Altered how?" "Collective consciousness," Leora explained, gesturing wildly with her mug. "If enough of us focus on changing a nightmare, it changes. The data reflects it. So what? We think happy thoughts and the universe throws us a bone. More like we stop dreaming about hamsters," Leora said, "and start dreaming about something useful. Like Thrin tripping over their own tentacles." "That's a tall order," Trillin mused, his voice tinged with skepticism. "We can't even agree on lunch." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Squidward's voice as grating as nails on a chalkboard. "Reminder, compliance is mandatory. The High Council is monitoring all progress." Trillin rolled his eyes. "Feels like we're living under a microscope and someone's about to start poking with a needle." "Let them poke," Leora muttered defiantly. "If this works, we might have a way to turn the tables. At least a little." Trillin nodded, his enthusiasm tempered by reality. "Great, now we just need to convince everyone else not to dream of their own demise." They spent the next few days testing Leora's theory, trying to rally the others in the clandestine network. It was like herding cats, if cats happened to be insomniac rebels with trust issues. Every meeting was a chaotic blend of whispered strategies and awkward silences, punctuated by the occasional outburst of gallows humor. "You want us to what?" Nico asked incredulously during one such gathering, his voice barely above a whisper. "Focus," Leora explained with the patience of a kindergarten teacher on her fifth coffee. "We need to focus on the same nightmare, the same outcome. Alter the pattern. And if we screw it up," Yara chimed in, her brows knitting together in trepidation. "We'll have nightmares about disco infernos instead of our impending doom," Trillin quipped. "But in theory, we can change the future, or at least give it a nudge." The group exchanged skeptical glances, like a bunch of cats staring at a cucumber. The concept was as foreign as the Thrin's cuisine, but they were desperate, and desperation breeds unorthodox solutions. It's a gamble, Nico conceded, scratching his head, but better than doing nothing. Over the next few weeks, they tried to manipulate their dreams with the finesse of a surgeon wielding a bowling ball. The process was equal parts frustrating and hilarious, and more often than not, they ended up with bizarre nightmares that were less apocalyptic and more Saturday morning cartoon. Leora kept her spirits up with a steady stream of synth caffeine and sarcasm, both of which flowed freely in the sterile halls of the Thrin Monastery. Meanwhile, the High Council loomed like the world's least welcome house guest, ever-present and impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came when Leora had another nightmare, a twisted vision of the Thrin's tentacles slapping against the cold steel of the monastery, flames licking at the edges. But this time she managed to alter it. The flames receded, the tentacles retreated. It felt like nudging the universe's elbow, and for once it didn't elbow back. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "Trillin," she hissed, shaking him awake. "I did it. I changed the nightmare." Trillin groaned, rubbing his eyes like he could scrub away the fatigue. "Did the universe notice, or is it still ignoring us?" "I don't know," Leora admitted, biting her lip. "But it's a start." The news spread quickly among their small band of rebels, a flicker of hope in the oppressive gloom. If they could control the nightmares even a little, it might be enough to turn the tide. But like all things worth doing, it was easier said than done. "Think we can pull this off?" Nico asked one day, his voice a strange mix of hope and doubt. "Honestly," Leora replied, sipping her synth caffeine like liquid courage, "I haven't got a bloody clue, but if we're going down, let's at least make it interesting." The process was slow and fraught with setbacks. Some nights, Leora managed to alter the nightmares, nudging the flow of events just enough to feel a difference. Other nights, she was consumed by them, the shadows wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. But they kept at it, stubbornly refusing to concede defeat. The humans might be facing a cosmic bully with a penchant for mind games, but if they've learned anything from their history, it's that underdogs bite. And bite they did, with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Each altered nightmare felt like a small victory, a step closer to loosening the Thrin's grip. It wasn't much, but it was enough to kindle the embers of rebellion, a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. "At this rate," Trillin joked one night, "we might just dream ourselves out of this mess." "Or into another one," Leora countered, her smile wry as ever. "But at least it'll be a mess of our choosing." Still, the process was far from foolproof. The nightmares remained a wild, unpredictable beast, and mastering them was akin to taming an interstellar dragon. But the humans pressed on, driven by the tantalizing possibility that they might finally have a weapon of their own. As the days dragged on, the strain took its toll. Nerves were frayed, tempers flared, and the ever-present threat of discovery loomed large. The Thrin's surveillance felt like a noose tightening around their necks, a grim reminder that failure was not an option. Despite the odds, they persevered, driven by a shared determination to reclaim their lives, their freedom. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep them moving forward, one tentative step at a time. Leora's nightmares became a nightly battleground, a place where fear and hope waged war for control. Each victory, no matter how small, felt like a triumph, a reminder that they were not powerless, that they still had a fighting chance. In the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about survival, about refusing to bow to the Thrin's tyranny. And as long as they had breath in their bodies, they would continue to fight, to dream, to hope. Because in the grand scheme of things, resilience was the greatest weapon of all, and sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. One night, Leora lay staring at the ceiling, the familiar hum of the monastery, a soothing lullaby. She felt the weight of her exhaustion, the pull of sleep, but resisted. Her mind raced with possibilities, with the potential of what they might achieve. "Hey," Trillin murmured, breaking the silence. "You think we'll ever wake up from this nightmare?" "Maybe," Leora replied, her voice soft but firm. "But if not, we'll just have to make it a dream worth living." And with that, she closed her eyes, ready once more to step into the realm of nightmares, to face whatever lay ahead. Because if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was that the future belonged to those who dared to dream, even in the darkest of times. Leora leaned back in her chair, staring at the flickering screens like they were a particularly boring rerun of her least favorite show. "All right, folks, here's the deal," she started, voice as dry as the synth caffeine, barely keeping her vertical. "We've got the Thrin breathing down our necks, and I don't know about you, but I'm not a fan of giving intergalactic squid what they want." Trillin, forever juggling his tablet as if it'd sprout legs and run off, chimed in. "Last I checked, they're more interested in our toenails than our freedom. Which is why we're going to do the impossible," Leora replied, a wry grin tugging at her lips. "We're going to change the future, one nightmare at a time." Nico scratched his head, looking like a man trying to solve a Rubik's Cube with his feet. "So we focus on these nightmares and what? The Thrin just up and leave?" "Not exactly," Leora said, her tone laced with irony. "But if we alter enough nightmares, create enough chaos, we might just distract them long enough to trip over those tentacles of theirs." Hopefully into a black hole. Yara shook her head, skepticism oozing from every pore. And if they don't, then we get to say we tried, Trillin interjected, smirking, and maybe dream of something involving a nice, non-hostile takeover. The group exchanged looks, a silent agreement passing between them. It was a ridiculous plan, bordering on lunacy, but at this point, it was the best shot they had. The Thrinn might have control over half the galaxy, but if there was one thing humans were good at, it was making a mess of things, preferably someone else's things. So we're all agreed, Leora asked, sweeping her gaze across the room. We focus on the nightmares, change what we can, and hope for the best. Nico shrugged, hands stuffed in his pockets. Why not? I've always wanted to die in my sleep. Don't we all? Yara muttered under her breath. The plan was simple, in the way that a math problem involving quantum physics could be considered simple. They needed to synchronize their nightmares, to focus collectively on altering the fabric of their shared fears. It was like herding a bunch of insomniac cats, each with their own vivid, terrible dreams. The first night was a disaster. Leora woke up drenched in sweat, the echoes of a nightmare involving a Thrinn victory parade and a whole lot of fireworks still ringing in her ears. Not the outcome they were aiming for, unless they wanted to be the surprise guests of honor. Trillin looked equally worse for wear, his hair sticking up in odd directions. So that was fun, he remarked dryly. What's next? A group sing-along, more focus, Leora insisted, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. We need to find the common thread, something we can all latch onto. Besides our impending doom, Nico asked, not entirely sarcastic. Exactly, something different, Leora replied, her voice firm despite the early ire. They gathered again, huddled in a dimly lit corner of the monastery that the Thrinn tended to overlook, mostly because there was nothing there to collect. Leora outlined the plan once more, her words punctuated by the occasional cynical observation. We need chaos, distraction. If we can shake things up enough, we might just slip through the cracks, she said, her tone almost hopeful. And if we don't, Yara asked, her skepticism palpable, then we keep trying, until we run out of nightmares or patience, Trillin replied, a resigned chuckle escaping his lips. Over the next few days, they honed their technique. It was a grueling process, not unlike teaching a cat to fetch, but they persevered. Leora became a regular at the synth caffeine dispenser, while Trillin's tablet seemed to grow more neurotic with every passing hour. But there were moments, brief and glorious, when it seemed to work. A nightmare would shift, the edges blurring into something less terrifying, more manageable. The Thrinn's control felt a little less ironclad, a little more brittle. Did you feel that? Leora asked one morning, the excitement in her voice cutting through the fog of exhaustion. Trillin nodded, eyes wide. I did. It was like a switch was flipped. Nico frowned, clearly trying to grasp the concept. So we just keep flipping switches until the lights go out. Pretty much, Leora replied, her smile a mix of triumph and disbelief. The Thrinn's surveillance continued unabated, their cold, calculating eyes ever watchful. But bit by bit, the humans began to see changes, small at first, like a crack in a dam, but growing steadily with each altered nightmare. The predicted catastrophe, the one that had loomed over their heads like a sword poised to drop, began to falter. The future, once set in stone, started to shift. Leora could almost taste the change, a tantalizing promise just out of reach. Do you think they know? Yara asked one evening, her voice a whisper. Probably, Leora replied, her tone nonchalant. But I'd like to see them try and stop us. The night stretched on, the humans locking onto their nightmares with a grim determination. Each dream was a battlefield, a place where fear and courage danced a delicate waltz. And each victory, no matter how small, was a reminder that they were not powerless, that they still had a say in their fate. It wasn't until a week later that they realized just how far they'd come. The Thrinn began to falter, their control slipping like oil through fingers. Reports of unrest, of rebellion started trickling in, whispers of a genetic caste system beginning to unravel. We're doing it, Trillin said, his voice a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. We're actually doing it. Leora nodded, her heart pounding with an unfamiliar sense of hope. We're giving them a taste of their own medicine. The Thrinn, for all their superiority, had underestimated the humans. They'd failed to account for their resilience, their stubborn refusal to give up, no matter the odds. And in the end, it was this unexpected strength, this unity in the face of adversity, that proved their undoing. The humans continued to chip away at the Thrinn's control, each altered nightmare a step closer to freedom. The future was no longer a predetermined path but a malleable entity, one that could be shaped by sheer force of will. Think we'll get out of this alive? Nico asked one night, his tone almost casual. Who knows? Leora replied, her smile wry. But if we do, I'm throwing one hell of a party. Yara snorted, an unexpected laugh escaping her lips. I'll drink to that. With each passing day, the Thrinn's grip loosened, their once ironclad control slipping through their tentacled fingers. The humans, against all odds, had turned the tide, wielding the power of their nightmares like a weapon. It wasn't perfect, nor was it easy, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope, to kindle the flames of rebellion. Enough to remind the galaxy that humans, for all their flaws and foibles, were not to be underestimated. "We should be proud," Leora said one morning, her voice soft but resolute. "We've done the impossible." Trillin nodded, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "And we did it our way." The future was still uncertain, a tangled web of possibilities. But for the first time in a long time, the humans felt like they had a chance to reclaim their lives, their freedom, a chance to write their own destiny. As the Thrin's control continued to collapse, the humans prepared for the next step. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be safe. But if there was one thing they knew how to do, it was to persevere in the face of adversity. Leora glanced around at her fellow rebels, her heart swelling with pride. They were a motley crew, a ragtag band of dreamers and fighters, but they were hers, and together they'd achieved the impossible. "Ready for the next round?" she asked, her voice laced with anticipation. "Ready as I'll ever be," Trillin replied, his eyes gleaming with determination. The galaxy was vast and unforgiving, a place where nightmares lurked around every corner. But the humans, against all odds, had discovered a strength they never knew they possessed. And as long as they had each other, they would continue to fight, to dream, to hope. Because in the grand scheme of things, resilience was the greatest weapon of all. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. As the group dispersed, ready to face whatever lay ahead, Leora felt a sense of calm wash over her. The future was uncertain, a shifting tapestry of chaos and possibility. But whatever happened, she knew one thing for certain: they were not alone, and together they would make the darkness tremble. The Thrin's control had crumbled like an overbaked biscuit, leaving the humans to pick up the crumbs and figure out what to do next. The once sterile Thrin monastery now hummed with a different kind of energy, less ominous, more chaotic, like a toddler on synth caffeine. Leora stood at the center of the chaos, watching as people moved about with a kind of manic determination. They were free, or as close to it as anyone could be, with the High Council still poking their noses in every now and again. But freedom came with its own set of headaches, like figuring out how to run a society that wasn't predicated on nightmare-fueled oppression and the odd fascination with toenail clippings. She looked around her, spotting Trillin juggling his tablet like it was a particularly demanding pet. He was grinning, a rare and slightly unsettling sight. "Looks like we're actually doing this," he said, his tone incredulous. "Building a new world and all, yeah. Well, someone's gotta keep the lights on," Leora replied, smirking. "And I guess that someone's us," Trillin snorted, who knew humanity's greatest weapon was being too stubborn to know when we're beat. "We're like intergalactic cockroaches," Leora said, nodding. "Just when you think we're squashed, we skitter out from under the boot." She turned her attention to Nico and Yara, who were debating the merits of various governmental structures with all the enthusiasm of a pair of cats fighting over a particularly juicy mouse. Or maybe they were just arguing about who had to clean up the cloning lab. Hard to tell sometimes. Nico threw up his hands. "I'm just saying democracy is all well and good until you realize people are idiots. And what's your alternative?" Yara countered, eyebrow arched. "Dictatorship, because that's worked out so well for everyone. Maybe something in between," Leora interjected, stepping into the fray. "A nice hybrid of not letting people make too many stupid decisions while still giving them the illusion of choice. Sounds like marketing," Trillin quipped, and they all shared a grim chuckle. The mood was lighter, even if the task ahead was daunting. They were, after all, trying to rebuild a society from the ashes of a particularly invasive alien regime. But if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was muddling through and hoping for the best, preferably while making fun of their predicament. Speaking of choices, Trillin said, "You think we should do something about the nightmares?" "I mean, now that we know they're not just random brain farts," Leora nodded, considering. "Couldn't hurt. We should try to harness them, maybe use them as some kind of early warning system. So we can avoid being blindsided by another batch of tentacle enthusiasts." "Yara, you've been quiet," Nico observed, his tone laced with playful suspicion. "What's your take?" Yara shrugged, her skepticism still intact despite everything. "I think we're all a bunch of lunatics for thinking we can just decide to be a society again. But hey, lunacy's kind of our thing now, isn't it?" "Nail on the head," Leora agreed, gesturing emphatically. "If we can use nightmares to dodge future disasters, and maybe even predict the next big fashion faux pas, why not? Can't be worse than the Thrin's idea of style," Trillin quipped, gesturing to a Thrin relic that looked like a cross between a hat and a sea anemone. They spent the next few days brainstorming, the monastery's formerly oppressive halls now echoing with laughter and the odd argument. People squabbled over everything from resource allocation to the best way to brew synth caffeine, but it felt good. It felt human. As plans took shape, the new society began to resemble a patchwork quilt, rough around the edges, a bit frayed in places but undeniably theirs. And amidst it all, Leora felt a strange sense of peace. Maybe it was the calm before the next storm, but for now she'd take it. "All right," Leora announced one morning, clapping her hands together to draw everyone's attention. "Let's talk structure. We need something that works, something that doesn't involve nightmares or toenails, preferably." Nico raised a hand. "Can we call it the Federated Union of Not Being Screwed?" Yara snorted. "Catchy, but maybe we should aim for something that won't make the High Council twitch." "Fine, fine. How about the Provisional Commonwealth of Not Getting Tentacled?" "Bit wordy, but it's a start," Nico suggested, grinning. Leora sighed, shaking her head with a fond smile. "How about we focus less on the name and more on the framework? Something that doesn't implode the first time someone decides they don't like the color scheme." "Bureaucracy," Trillin said, feigning a shudder. "The true nightmare? Hey, at least it's our nightmare now," Leora replied, her tone wry. "And we'll make sure it stays that way." Together, they drafted the beginnings of their new governance, taking cues from what little history they could remember, and conveniently forgetting the parts that hadn't worked out so well. The High Council, still looming in the background like a particularly nosy neighbor, would have to be appeased, but that was a problem for tomorrow. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" Yara said one evening, her voice low as they surveyed the progress from a quiet corner. "What, being in charge of our own destiny for a change?" Leora asked, arching a brow. "Yeah. And doing it without a Thrin breathing down our necks," Yara replied, her tone almost wistful. "Weird's good," Leora said. "Weird means we're doing something right. Still, can't help but wonder if they know," Yara mused. "The Thrin, I mean. That we're out here, making our own way, they probably do. But I'd like to think they're too confused by our lack of toenail offerings to do much about it," Leora said, smirking. As the days turned into weeks, the humans continued to build, to laugh, to argue. They were awkward and disorganized, and sometimes it felt like herding space cats, but they were doing it. They were making their way in a universe that had very nearly swallowed them whole. Leora found herself at the synth caffeine dispenser one morning, contemplating the future. It was still murky, like the bottom of a particularly questionable cup of coffee, but it was theirs. For better or worse, they'd carved out a place for themselves. "Hey," Trillin said, appearing at her elbow with his ever-present tablet. "We've got a council meeting in an hour. Think you can tear yourself away from that riveting brew long enough to join us?" Leora chuckled, shaking her head. "I suppose I could manage that." "Anything on the agenda that doesn't involve arguing over who gets the nice chairs. We're actually discussing how to implement a system for using nightmares constructively. You know, instead of just using them as an excuse to avoid the in-laws." She raised an eyebrow. "And whose brilliant idea was that?" "Yours," Trillin replied, grinning. "Naturally, flattery will get you everywhere," Leora said dryly, following him back to the makeshift council chamber. The meeting was predictably chaotic, a cacophony of voices and opinions. But amidst the chaos, a semblance of order began to emerge. They were learning, adapting, growing. And maybe, just maybe, they were on the right track. By the time evening rolled around, Leora was exhausted but content. She sat with her fellow rebels, watching the stars appear one by one, like pinpricks of hope in the night sky. "You ever think about what's next?" Nico asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not really," Leora said, kind of focused on the here and now. "But I figure as long as we keep doing what we're doing, stumbling forward, laughing in the face of doom, we'll be all right." "Here's to being all right," Yara said, raising an imaginary glass. "All right and then some," Trillin added, his grin infectious. As they sat there, gazing up at the vastness of space, Leora felt a rare sense of optimism. It was a new beginning, one built on nightmares and resilience, on stubbornness and snark. It was imperfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, the future seemed wide open, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with all the colors of human ingenuity and madness. Because if there was one thing humanity knew how to do, it was to persevere, to fight and laugh and dream, even when the odds were stacked sky-high against them. To turn nightmares into a source of strength, and to make the darkness tremble with the sheer force of their will. "We did it," Leora said softly, her voice carrying a weight of awe and disbelief. "Yeah," Trillin agreed, his voice equally hushed. "We really did," and as the stars continued to shine, the humans sat together, ready to face whatever came next. They were not alone, and together, they would make their mark on the galaxy, one snarky, resilient step at a time.